A very warm welcome to everyone. It's great to see the room is nearly full. Fantastic. Must be about 300 people, I think, that means. So welcome. My name's Mel Dodd. Most of you know me. I'm the Programme Director of Spatial Practice here at Central St Martin's. For those who don't, and we have a lot of guests here tonight, so thank you very much for coming. I look forward to the evening and spending with you and also having you ask some questions at the end. The Spatial Practices programme runs a lecture series throughout term time, and we have a whole host of sort of formats. But this format particularly, we started last year in collaboration with Ollie Wainwright from The Guardian, and it was such a huge success that we decided to go again. So Fundamentals is running for the second time, slightly shorter and more intense, but and also a slightly more specific topic. So the format, Ollie's going to talk through a little bit through, but remember, a lot of students here, a lot of staff here. This is about architectural education. It's a debate. We'll try and make it as spicy as we can, but it's really important you build, think about questions and contribute, because there's going to be a generous opportunity to ask questions and get involved. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ollie, host with most.
Great, thanks, Mel. There's an onus on me now to make it as spicy as possible. Thank you all for coming. I don't know how many of you came to last year's Fundamental series, but it was consciously kind of anti-architecture last time. It was looking at the forces outside the profession, from the planning system to how the land market works, kind of trying to unpick the often invisible things that architects ignore, but which ultimately shape cities. This year's series is doing precisely the opposite, and it's kind of focusing inwards on the profession, shining a spotlight on architecture as a practice, as a business, as the way we work, the title of the next 3 events. Now, architecture is a curious profession. It's one of the few protected titles. You know, if you call yourself an architect and you're not, you can get chased down by the ARB, struck off and sued. You know, it's protected as an idea, which kind of makes you wonder what exactly it is they're trying to protect. Are they protecting the compulsory 7 years of education, which kind of leaves a lot of students with debts of up to £100,000? Are they protecting the fact you can graduate after 7 years and barely earn a London living wage, and then spend the rest of your career often working for weeks on end for free, with the kind of slight hope that you might possibly win a competition? These don't really sound like great things to be protecting. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be beginning tonight, we're looking at architectural education. In 2 weeks' time, focusing on working practices, interrogating the culture of internships, temporary contracts, long working hours, and lack of unions. 2 weeks after that, we'll be looking at procurement, so how we actually go about winning work, interrogating our risk-averse procurement practices, and the fact that we're competing for ever lower fees in this kind of endless race to the bottom. And then we'll finally conclude with the weekend symposium on labour practices and architecture, which Mel is convening. So tonight, architectural education. Let's see, learn. Is it outmoded, overpriced, and increasingly irrelevant? That was the kind of provocation that I set to our speakers tonight. Now, I mean, it's famously masochistic, architectural education. I'm just going to do a quick show of hands of how many people in the room are either studying or have studied architecture at some point. Okay. So you're all suckers for punishment. You know that. That's why you signed up for it. You know, we like to boast about how long we spent in the studio, these endless deadlines, the kind of never-ending culture of all-nighters in preparation for the humiliating final crit. But has it gone too far? I would argue that yes, it has. A recent survey in the Architects Journal revealed that more than a third of students said they'd sought medical help for mental health-related issues. Some saying their friends had actually been driven to suicide. Now, why have we ended up in this state? Partly it's seeing kind of increasing financial pressures on education, where, as I said earlier, after 5 years of full-time education, with increased tuition fees, increased living costs, and demands on endless equipment and materials, students can graduate with debts of up to 100 grand. What's the reward? When you graduate, again, a recent survey in the AJ revealed that the majority of Part 1s and 2s working in practice earn less than £20,000. That's after 3 to 5 years full-time education. And then we have to question what they're actually being taught in architecture schools. Endless accusations that student projects are retreating into these kind of introspective theoretical dream worlds, whether it's robotic trout farms on Mars or sinuous blobs generated by parametric algorithms. They're producing fantastical speculative projects, often to fulfill the theoretical agendas of their tutors, some would argue. Or, at the other end of the scale, we're kind of retreating into a very technocratic, practice-oriented model of education, which might be producing kind of apprenticeship, oven-ready students to go into practice, but will they, as a result, lack the kind of creative, critical faculties that some would argue you need to be a successful architect? So with me to unpick these questions and more, I have 4 people from the world of architectural education. I'm going to introduce them briefly now and then give proper introductions before they each speak. They'll be given 5 minutes to set out their stall. Then I'll invite them to our daytime TV set, have a nice chat, and then crucially open it up to you guys, to heckle, to pose burning questions, and to generally raise the temperature of the debate. So we've got Mel Dodd from our very own Central St Martin's. Then we're going to have Robert Mull, who's head of school at University of Brighton. Following him will be Deborah Saunt from DSDHA Architects, who's Director of Interpractice at the London School of Architecture. And finally, Bob Sheil, who is Director of the Bartlett. So beginning with Mel, Head of Spatial Practices at CSM. So she's the reason we're here tonight. She's taught architecture at a range of institutions since 1995, including Cambridge, the RCA, London Met, and RMIT in Melbourne. Her teaching, practice, and research interests focus on the relationship between social and political infrastructures and the built environment. So let me just load up her presentation. Great, over to Mel.
So this is quite exciting because I haven't actually been on this side of the debate before, so I'm going to go for it and try and be as timely as I possibly can in my 5-minute slot. This was the thing that we were asked to respond to, and I suppose my first thought was that without trying to push the burden onto others, I wanted to think about the profession. I think that ultimately there's a huge link between the profession of architecture and the way we educate for it, and that is where some of our serious issues lie, and also the possibilities for change. I start with a couple of images, and I'm not going to talk about them because in a way they're so obvious, but all of the first part of my 5 minutes is framing perhaps what they say about us as a profession. And this is both Grenfell and also more recently Carillion. So architecture is a public service in our view at this school. This is an overarching obligation and one which deserves a proper education. Architecture's ethical frameworks, rather than a series of reductive and professional codes, should really be viscerally linked to public service. Justice, human rights, eradication of equality, all delivered through micro-political and larger political modes of action. It's not a yawn, blah, blah, worthy call to be more participatory within practice or within education. It's much more than that. It's really moving beyond and asking what more we can do, not a call to radically overhaul the relevance of how the profession operates in order that people's livelihood becomes the foreground concern. This should be enacted by fundamentally realigning the professional scope of architectural services in our view. What's currently presented as a type of rationalised business flowchart by the RIBA, this is an image of the RIBA's plan of work, should be much more an ethical manifesto, aligned to something emerging more like a trade union in which integrity sits above all else. The RIBA plan of work actually proudly announces that it was fundamentally overhauled in 2013 to better meet the needs of the construction industry. And you'll notice that stage 0 is to identify the client's business case as a primary motivator. So maybe you'll agree with me that that's not really good enough. Even the British Medical Association is both the professional association and registered trade union for doctors. What does architecture have? What kind of industry produces websites like ArcLeaks or Concrete Action, whistleblowing sites that don't prove that we really don't have any other sort of avenue? Speaking of which, I had the recent great misfortune to host a RIBA visiting board here, where the discussion on the incorrect thickness of a slab dominated the entire 2-day conversation, and I really kid you not. When will we start to have equally detailed interrogation on where in a student's portfolio is knowledge of labour law, procurement perils, housing policy provision, viability assessments, and so on? So that all provides us, I think, with a good reflection on the way that architecture has been professionalised around the wrong body of knowledge, one of technical engineering. Search for the profession, this is what you get as an image. This is not to belittle technical performance. I stress that. It calls for reframing, and it doesn't imply dustbinning, the idea that you might build a form, make tectonic explorations in a very ambitious way. But architecture's close allegiance with this technical performance gives it a complicity with finance. The relationship between architecture and capital is fundamental yet fraught, because it's a relationship which is characterised by a market fundamentalist agenda that seems to take over and commodify our profession. So we perpetuate these misreadings through things like our boards, because the education is framed and enforced by the profession's tired and insipid frameworks of validation. Why on earth do we put up with it? My first point is really, therefore, that the profession needs an overhaul itself in respect of its professional values, its codes and the way it operates, and that once this is enacted, we might have a really radical overhaul of education. Perhaps we might even disengage it and talk about a loss of registration altogether. What to do with architectural education in the here and now, and maybe that's where this institution comes up. Do we want to ditch it altogether? That was a sort of prompt from Ollie. Return to apprenticeships, which are just coming into the fore, or indentured training. No, I don't think so. In terms of what I've said, our contemporary reality means that the corporate scales of architectural production will dominate apprenticeships. They'll instrumentalise the ethical scope and turn young architects into subservient handmaidens for mega practices. We need to engage with what an apprenticeship might be. We might want to subvert it. We might want to think about it ways it can provide more diversity in the profession. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's the way for the future of training architects. So what am I suggesting instead? In terms of spatial practices, we run a school that's firmly sited within an art school, and that's absolutely integral to what we think about. What I'm going to give you is 5 thoughts. I'm probably almost overrunning, but my 5 thoughts are fundamentally related to our manifesto, and this is our manifesto. I'm going to go through very quickly and talk about each one, not in terms of the manifesto points, but what the points might come out of it. So first of all, we see the production of space as fundamentally social and political. Yes, but we need to reinvigorate the contemporary educational institution. We need to understand that an institution can be, and is, a space of critical resistance. Don't chuck it in the bin. Rubbish higher education. It's a place of learning. It's critical to our society. It's a place we resist the forces of commodification, and we need to embrace that. Of course, universities are increasingly subject to vocationalisation, but we can be aware that they are absolutely full to the brimming with students and staff who are a force of resistance. We need to encourage in our students self-mobilisation, an upending of traditional hierarchies of teaching, experimentation, and hand some power over to students. As Michel Dessertu said, the system's not perfect. The system has cracks, but one promotes change by working in the cracks of the system. These are some images, by the way, that I'm showing which really come from our school, mainly our M-Arch course, because it's the newest course and captures some of this sort of these ideas. These are students that have worked out and about, as well as in the school, in different formats. We support not only the development of radical ideas, but also the radical potential of making and building. We need to engage in direct action. Everybody knows, especially architects, that a building's not a static object, but a moving project. It ages, it transforms its users, its context, it's modified by what happens, it's transformed through its life. We know this, but we don't know how to represent it. A portfolio of drawings is a woefully inadequate way in which to examine architecture. However virtuoso, however much they attempt to capture reality, they're merely a retreat into utopian or dystopian imaginings, as Ollie called it, colouring in. To do this, we need to find new ways to represent architecture, and here we believe actions are more powerful than drawings. Am I over?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, shit. Okay, very quickly then. You use our name to rethink our profession, imagining roles beyond disciplinary limits and actively engaging in our art school. We want to be experimental, push the boundaries of production into other areas, understand that art school's a place of resistance, and that our co-disciplines are much less complicit with finance than us. That was a class that Liza Fior ran. We engage creatively with the reality of the city around us and its legislative and economic constraints by undertaking live projects. We need to find a new way to do projects. I'm not going to go into that, but we do that through embedding people in the external world through placements and independent projects. And lastly, we need to provide flexible alternative pathways for study. Really, what I'm saying here is that we need to think about part-time modes. Our PG courses are all part-time here. Our fees are the lowest in the UK. We do what we can within a compromised system. Sorry for that plug, but no one seems to realise it. We want to give access to diverse groups. We don't undertake compulsory global field trips. We don't establish a culture of self-abuse. We don't ask people to do all-nighters. And we don't want you to sacrifice yourself because the abused become the abusers. Thank you. Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you, Mel. And you can sign up for the CSM Spatial Practices course on your way out. Next up, we have Professor Robert Mull, who is the head of School of Architecture and Design at the University of Brighton, as well as an honorary professor at the Moscow School of Architecture, where he's actually heading tomorrow. He was previously director of architecture and dean of the Cass Faculty of Arts and Design, and he is currently developing a global practice program focusing on live projects within the European refugee crisis and institutions including prisons, schools, and communities, which I think he's going to tell us about.
Yeah.
Over to you, Robert.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything that Mel said, which is going to be a problem for Ollie, I think, later on. Does anybody disagree with the fact that we live in careless times? Hands up. Just on... Agree or disagree? Disagree. I want to argue that in some ways, perhaps unwittingly, architectural education and architectural culture generally is complicit in that carelessness. These are some of the things I worry about in relation to architectural culture. On the left, an architectural culture that talks only to itself. In the middle, an architectural culture which is mediated and described by a media. Apologies to Ollie. And on the right, the highly dysfunctional world of architectural stardom. This is the male and female loos of an architecture school in Taiwan. That's deeply unhealthy. What are the reasons and what are the symptoms that relate to this carelessness? How do we know it exists? Some of them have been said. Long courses, debt, the fear of debt, high levels of stress and mental illness, unpaid interns, low wages, and a lack of collective action, or the collective defence of our rights as architectural students and workers, that long-awaited union that's never happened. Structures that exclude those with diverse life experiences and increasing elitism. And why, oh why, do women still leave architecture some 15 years after it was first raised? So I would argue that it's all about values, not mechanisms. And tonight we need to talk about values and not just credits, earn and learn, the ARB, RIBA, universities. Still unconvinced that it's necessary to talk about values? We'll look at the dominant language of architectural education. The unit, militaristic. The unit master, sexist. The crit, judgmental. The jury, punitive. The marketplace. All this sugared with some late 20th century idea of radicalism, of experimentation. If it's experimentation, then anything is possible. That's not right. So what are these values? They are based on competition, individualism, and self-interest, played out at an individual, unit, course, and institutional level, dividing and ruling, leaving education infantilized by its own vanity and incapable, tragically, of effectively dealing with pressing aesthetic, social, environmental, political issues. The fundamentals, if you like. So where does one look for alternative models, alternative values? And I've been searching for a long time. Since 2004, I've run the free unit. Absolute contradiction. Free and unit don't go together, but it does spell FU. The free unit started that experiment of trying to reverse some of those power structures, placing emphasis and returning responsibility to students, mobilizing and concentrating on their life experiences, making them spear carriers in their own dramas, not a spear carrier in my drama. Past 2 years, since leaving the CAF, I've been looking somewhere else. I've been working within the European refugee crisis. From the beaches of Lesbos to the farm camps of Izmir via Calais, trying to look at a different set of values. I found two things: a formal vitality and radicalism free from the hubris of education, which I recorded in 2 shows at the South Bank. And critically, alternative values based on cooperation, dialogue, sharing, and impact. A vitality we tried to capture at the Papers Festival at the Barbican that looked at the art, architecture, and design of the refugee crisis. But everywhere that I went, I met the disenfranchised, the restless, and those excluded from formal education, not just by its economics, but by its values. They were building shelters, managing the housing of 10,000 refugees, providing maps that documented the disappearance of 200 unaccompanied children, organising football tournaments, cooking, knitting, being architects. I was constantly asked, why can't this be education? Why do I have to return to formal education and accept its values? I can't bear it. I can't go back. Why? Because they had experienced and worked in a value system based on cooperation, collective action, sharing, generosity, applied to one of the most pressing issues of all time. Powerful stuff. This was a wake-up call and a challenge. As a result of this, in a very gentle way, we have set up the Global Free Unit, based upon a network that came out of the Free Unit, the Free World. The programme has academic and NGO partners in Sweden, Russia, Korea, Ireland, South Africa, and many other places. This network, this Free World, this Global Practice Unit, is where students and those embedded in the context work together, borrowing the cheapness and the sponsored economy of live project classrooms, to borrow the Civic University phrase, where they share experience, skills, and broker new futures. This year, we are working within the refugee crisis in Lesbos, in Izmir. We are about to start working in Wandsworth Prison, and we are working tomorrow on a project around art as labour, looking at the social potential in rural situations of art practice in Russia. So one starting point for tonight's debate: perhaps architectural education has already left the building. It is live, situated, borderless, humane, generous, careful and useful. And in doing so, no lanyards, no carpets to pay for, no vanity projects to fund, just pure education. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks Robert. And architectural education has left the building makes a perfect segue to our next speaker, Deborah Saunt from DSDHA Architects, who is the Director of Interpractice at the London School of Architecture, which claims to be a nomadic architecture school without a building, which uses the city itself as its campus and aims to lower the barriers to architectural education with lower fees and students spending half of their time working in practice. Over to Deborah.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting you're talking about values because My slideshow starts with them. We as an organisation have spent a lot of time dealing with a lot of practicalities, but above it, overarching, is the question of why are we doing it and what drives us. And it is that the group of people who we're surrounding ourselves with and collaborating with want to see that people living in cities, we're a very urban school and we've confined our view to sort of urban situations, that people in cities live more fulfilled and more sustainable lives. And our school equips future leaders to design and promote innovations in architecture and cities that contribute to that change. So we want our school to kind of lead from the front and change the way cities work. So we ask our students from the very beginning, at the interview and at every time that we meet them, what change do you want to see in the world? These are high-level questions that permeate everything we do. And how does your architecture, what you're spending your time doing, contribute to that change? And who are you as an individual? Surprise, surprise, we actually care about designers as individuals rather than a unit system. What kind of designer and architect do you want to be? And we do this because, obviously, today, half of humanity lives in cities, but cities just occupy 3% of the Earth's surface, yet it contributes to 75% of the carbon emissions. It's a critical location. And then architecture, as our kind of guru, Peter Buchanan, who leads our critical practice and critical theory division, states, architecture is the nexus where all disciplines and fields of knowledge converge, as fundamental as language, rather sort of building on what Robert was saying. But we talk about a profession, so I disagree with you, Mel. I think architecture is a much more diverse and embracing understanding of spatial intelligence. It's the thing we have when we're at home as kids making those first dens. We all have it, or through necessity have it. And we know that at the moment the challenge is to anticipate what are the new tasks that we can put our unique talents to and to develop new skills that are relevant for years to come. How did it all happen? Will Hunter, who's in Yale this evening, set out in the AR a proposition for alternative routes for architecture. We gathered together as a group of practitioners and academics and said, let's get off our arses and actually do something about this. He was going to call it ARFA, or RFOD or something. I came up with the name London School of Architecture, said sounds like the LSE. If it's good for them, we'll claim architecture. It was available, so we took it. We use the city as campus, which is what you all do. In the last 10 years, there's been a revolution. It's called the shared economy and digital culture. We can now use the city as our base. And fundamental in my interest of what's permeated my whole life as an architect and as a student has been, how do you merge this schism between practice and academia? So we've engaged over 100 practices now that act as a kind of base. This network acts as a base from which we spring. And it's all founded on collaboration. Because we understand, as Malcolm Gladwell said, that the 20th century was about lone geniuses, whereas the 21st is about smart people working together, and that's just what architecture is. So students have their lectures in offices here in Grimshaw. They have their crits here in Allies and Morrison. They work together, and they actually use the practices as their studio. This is first year. When they get into second year, they have a studio and they have a more conventional singular project. So the collaborative first year that I oversee doesn't have a unit system. We just have tutors. We work out who we want to work with. They're tutors from our network of practices. They come into the school, wherever it is that day, and teach. I thought I'd got rid of this. So the first year comprises a series of modules. Sorry, I should just hold back that one. Comprises a series of modules. I lead the Design Think Tank project, which is a merging of design research led by practices with the students in collaboration. And for the 3 days a week the students are working, they earn enough money in that first year to pay their fees for both years. So it comes out as a cost-neutral option. The second year offers The history of design methodology. How often are you actually asked, or have you asked yourself, how do you go about the process of design? It's the big missing question in architectural education. How do you make those decisions, and how have others done it in the past? That then goes on to a sequence of comprehensive design projects, which explore the kind of individual passions of the student, as well as ticking all the boxes in terms of accreditation, etc. Every project has to be propositional, because it's too easy to just be critical. Everything has to be relevant. You have to offer answers, not just questions. It has to be innovative and be restless and curious. And as we said, metropolitan, based in the city. And, dirty word, entrepreneurial, because actually architecture, if you want to practice it, is a business. It is embedded in the filthy lucre of global exchange. To pretend it isn't is naive. We kind of confront it head on and ask, what can we do about it by understanding it, not being complicit, by actually understanding it. So this year we've refined our offer and our focus to really embed our work within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We ask students to define their own community of practice and how that might evolve. So rather than saying you're just going to follow our unit system, we ask you to situate yourself within the whole wealth of different ways of understanding architecture and we like contradictory community of practices. And we ask, what kind of innovation as an architect are you interested in? Is it the wow factor of disruptive change, or actually more akin to incremental change, where things change over time and are based on precedent, rather than the idea of all change just for the sake of it? Some of the students' work comes from ethical dwellings for Generation Y. These are the design think tank practices. So these are 5 or 6 students working with a practitioner to come up with a kind of policy-led design proposition. New Knowledge looked at new platforms, collaborative exchange between architects. Their work was widely published in the RIBAJ, went on to talk in Holland. Global Currents has been looking at the right to breathe and involved in protests. New Knowledge, led by Assemble, was intrigued by the process of what we do with dead bodies at an urban scale and their impact. Architectural Agency has looked at the world of work and the way in which it is really changing. Going back to this comment that Mel said at the beginning, education, life and work are blurring, and the government is basically trying to get rid of higher education and make work pay for education. We challenged that. The students looked at how you could embed learning within workspaces over time. They even priced their projects, and then they recycled their ideas and won a national competition with it. So fantastic. My own students last year looked at cultural infrastructure, don't worry, I'm just coming to the end, and really tackled this awful fallacy of what makes a city so appealing, so wonderful, and the fact that all of cultural policy seemed to be embedded in heavy institutions like Olympicopolis, the V&A and the Tate, these exclusive heavy institutions that ignored the small, extra small and medium places where real culture is developed and nurtured. We looked at a tactical system of networks of spaces and mobility, much like the LSA operating 24 hours across the city, and looked at those connections between them. Hijacked infrastructure. We spend a lot on transport infrastructure, and we think that should pay for cultural infrastructure too. So we came up with these fantastic propositions for transport interchanges that looked at perhaps at transport interchanges, rather than trying to put affordable housing into the dark, miserable spaces at the back of buildings, why don't we have affordable workspaces, for example? There's a whole wealth of propositions came out of this. So that's the workspace that they came up, this in Whitechapel. They also looked at transport infrastructure. There is a 24-hour city in London called Heathrow. It has huge car parks that are actually going to be demounted in the next 10 to 20 years. We said we'll have some of that, thank you very much. We talked to Heathrow, and they're extremely excited about the idea that between 11 and 4:30 a.m, when they don't have flights, they can make a lot of noise. So why not go to Heathrow and look at that as a place of kind of nighttime culture. The students presented widely across London, even invited to the LSE, which we thought was interesting. And then day before yesterday, I spoke at the Architecture Foundation, where my student from the LSA reworked cultural infrastructure and made it appealing at night. So we did the nighttime version of cultural infrastructure, came up with our metabolic spatial strategies for nighttime, took it out on the railway lines, and we came up with the idea of 24-hour clubbing at Heathrow. So club class takes on a new meaning when you go to Heathrow. But for me, the final point I want to make, and I'm sorry for having gone on so long, is that for me, the next step of the LSA is not just about you guys as students. I'm still a student, I'm still working and learning, and I think there's such a missed opportunity for education and agitation to be a continuous process rather than one defined by traditional modes. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's 3 cheers for lifelong learning. Our next speaker is going to present from his laptop because he's more high-tech than the rest of us, because he is the professor of, let me get this right, Architecture and Design through Production at the Bartlett and director of the Bartlett School of Architecture. He's been teaching there since 1995, when his collaborative practice 16 makers were appointed artists in residence in the School of Architecture's workshop. His work focuses on the intersection of making, craft, and technology in architecture. And he's looking at crossovers between making, performance, and 3D scanning. So over to Bob Sheil.
Thank you, Ollie. I'm plugged in. Now, I got a very different email from Ollie to everybody else. So thank you very much for inviting me. I could be boring and say I agree with everything that was said. I do agree with a lot of it. I have a different view on some of it. And I might push that side of my talk just to spice the room up, as we've been instructed to do. So the email I got from Ollie was talk about yourself and your interest in how you've got into architecture. So I've got about 45 minutes, I presume, about that. Yeah. So he's kindly mentioned I started out in a workshop, formed a practice when I was a student. I started architecture actually in my mid-20s for the fourth time actually. I tried technology first in Dublin, came to London, part-time architecture, thought it was rubbish, tried it again, thought it was rubbish, went full-time, gave it a go. And for some peculiar reason, I haven't left it. But it was an extraordinary, privileged time. It was a time it was a time of innocence, it feels like now. We drew by hand. We talked about these things as if they're real. You know, this is a building. Nobody queried that concept at all. This was a building, yeah? And we all went, yeah, okay, got you. But because of my background in Dublin, where I knew how to draw, I didn't quite know how to think completely at that stage, but I certainly knew how to draw. I felt there was something that disruptive that needed to happen in my own practice. So myself and my partner, Nick Callicott, decided not to present drawings anymore, but only to present objects and made things in the school. And we started to try and disrupt that conversation by talking about the production of architecture rather than the production of the drawing. So skipping ahead to roundabout now, that's really informed my fascination in the world of how things are made and how we transfer information from drawings to things, back to drawings, through industries. We work in a collaborative practice, either in education or in industry or in any other form of life. And this journey that I think that goes through drawing, through objects, through practice, talks about all the themes that this fundamental lecture series is about. Labour, work, learning, production, and so on. Politics as well. And I think by taking that journey, the thing that I found most powerful about it is you see your own practice from another position. It's not always comfortable, but one of the things about it that is intriguing is your ability to form an agency in that chain of exchanges. But I did think Ollie wants to talk about other stuff, so I will, okay? That's enough about me. Some of you might know who this is, but it doesn't matter who it is. It's somebody looking at an exhibition in an architecture school. I thought I might perhaps talk about the one I know most of all about, but I think the points apply to lots of schools. Exhibitions go on at the end of the year. They're a display of production, they're a display of perhaps a student's favorite piece of work from their year. Audiences come in, but you get this curious kind of gaze that occurs from that audience of what does the work mean? What is the work trying to say to me? Even though I might be an architect myself, I might be a parent, I might be a future student. Exhibitions are curious things. They're a ritual that come at the end of a process of education, but really what their core purpose is to raise questions about what it is a school is producing. This is a very different looking exhibition to the exhibitions that were had in my day. I think that's the point that I find fascinating. The message that's coming out through this particular act and production is one of change, it's one of dialogue, and you'll find different types of message in every space. The relationship that's been raised already in previous presentations between schools and practice is absolutely fundamental. So moving forward with fundamentals, you cannot be a school without having a relationship with practice. It's meaningless if there is no relationship. It's also meaningless to reject that relationship when we talk about schools. A school is not a hermetically sealed environment, and neither is a unit. It's a network. It's a very, very, very edgeless network in a sense. And this is the work that comes out of a school by the work of recent graduates that informs the productions of schools. Schools are changing a lot. Mell's school is this fascinating space set within the context of an art department. We've been through quite a lot of changes in the last few years, and you'll see these sorts of spaces emerging in schools all around the world. Somebody described it recently at an event. Why is it that architecture schools feel more like factories than offices right now? It's because we're taking possession of the process of production as critical, engaged artists or engineers or theorists or whatever you might want it to be. It's a space that requires and needs critique and investigation and taking apart. The production that informs that through research requires dialogue between the production of staff as tutors, their production of their own work, and informing students equally progressive texts. Now, this is the structure you'll see in a lot of schools of architecture around the country today. A number of core architecture programs that are meeting RIBA criteria and ARB criteria to fulfill the route to registration. We all know there's a problem with it. We all know it costs too much, it takes too long. It's excluding people from it that have every right to take part. I'm certainly from the generation that thinks education should be free, but unfortunately it isn't. I'm working with that environment, working with that fact. Feel a lot of people of my age feel deeply uncomfortable about the fact that our education was free and we're in institutions where we're charging fees for our students. The unit system's been mentioned. In our school, there are about more than 30 units on what we call the professionally accredited programs, but we now have 56 units in the school in total. This is not a school with one manifesto. This is a federation of ideas. This is a network of conversations and thoughts. This network produces at least 3,000 projects a year. It's not, 56 projects a year. It's at least 3,000 projects a year. It's also sitting in the context of a faculty which has over 3,500 students, 11 other departments. The existence of architecture within a network of other practices and other disciplines is vital to its meaning, and it's vital to its progression. These are the drawings that our staff make when we get together for an away day. The thoughts about the school, where it's going, how their relationship with the school could evolve, could change. The word fundamental appears here actually quite a few times. In fact, I was in a meeting just last night with about 50 or 60 staff talking about where the school is going. Everyone's talking about it. These are events that are happening in London tonight. Some of them the Bartlett, some of them not. One about computation, one about street life, one about economics. Mariano Mazzucato has joined the Bartlett, you would know her. The notion of economics coming into the School of Architecture as a conversation, as a debate, constructing realities about the production of the built industry. What I want to focus on now are just words about things that I think themes, prompts, provocations for our discussion tonight. This line is dotted because I think there's a blurred meaning between all of the words that are above and below it. The importance of research and the notion of synthesis. The point of locating an architecture school within a research environment, within a university, is to engage at research. It's not to produce just one isolated program. That's meaningless. So the relationship with other disciplines is the vital purpose of why we exist. The idea of the research practice, of course, is to question, to challenge, to fail, to break, to do all the sorts of things that are very difficult to do when you're outside that domain. Out of that practice comes the skill to understand how one synthesizes different scenarios, synthesizes different disciplines, synthesizes different contributions to projects. Freedom. Freedom to think in different ways. The unit system isn't perfect. It's a system to provoke. It's not a system to dictate. If a unit system dictates, it's failing. And there are units that fail in that regard. But its purpose is to offer freedom for debate in an ecology which is in a school. A freedom of speech, freedom of action, freedom to question, freedom to reinvent the discipline, freedom to rehearse, freedom to propose. Relevance of that conversation is vital to all of it. If there's no relevance in that conversation, it's drifting off the edge of the map. Relevance to be informed, to question, not to be isolated, to be influential, and to persuade. Porosity, spatial porosity, intellectual porosity, creative porosity is vital. You can only get that by having diversity. Porosity of thought, porosity of access, interaction, engagement, changing direction. Accidents are vital to understanding what architecture is. Foundations, understanding what you're building through the process of learning, understanding what you're recalibrating with that knowledge in terms of your prior understanding of that discipline or whatever it might be. Radical, a word often misused. Things that are said to be radical are often not, but the idea of radical is to disrupt, to critique, to diffuse, to reject, to outmode, to pioneer, to tear things apart. Foundations, again, to reinforce those radical principles, not to consolidate things, not to pass on traditions and not allow them to change. Forms of production, forces of production, methods of production, and consequences of production are territories that architectural practice, education, and research is engaged with and must debate with. That relates to the idea of having spaces where production can be witnessed and can be performances one can partake in. Having access to spaces of production challenges where you might fit in the spectrum of the world of devising ideas and delivering ideas and who those ideas might be for. Purpose, the social purpose of one's work, the cultural purpose of one's work, the intellectual purpose of one's work, the environmental purpose. Perspective, relating back to freedom. If an organization cannot use its collective intelligence, its collective ability, its collective creativity to push the boundary of that subject, to find a new domain for it, to find a new meaning for it, to find a new place for its relevance, well, then it's just playing a steady note. Skill is something which almost felt like a dirty word until a few years ago. If you mentioned the word skill in a conversation, I did once, and I was told we were trying to turn the school into a polytechnic. To me, I came from a word of skill, learning how to draw and how to make things. It seemed to me to make myself useful in the world somehow. Having skills was something I could exchange with somebody else and understand their skills knitting with mine. An architectural practice, whatever form it might take, whatever place it might take place in, has to have skill. Making and breaking, these two words, vital to the notion of the status of the work itself. Exhibitions cannot possibly convey the totality of the process of getting to the point of that last piece of work. The last piece of work is really a shop window gesture. The process of getting there is vitally important, far more important. And that process involves making and breaking. Making canons and breaking canons, as Jane Rendell has recently opened up as a conversation in the school. Notions of contribution and collaboration. It's been said already, we operate in a collaborative world. The idea that you could exist or imagine or fool yourself into thinking you're only an individual and only your individual thoughts matter is pointless. And the notion of unity and federation. Schools are federations, and this relates to notions of leadership. There's a very old-fashioned, outmoded, dead idea that schools are led by one idea. It's absolutely preposterous. They're federations of debate, like perhaps the debate we're having here tonight. Insiders and outsiders. We've seen this game played all the time in all walks of life and all avenues and domains of life. Insiders can offer a view or a position on the practice of legacy, of standard perhaps, of memory, of momentum, but they must be disrupted. You have to have outsiders all the time coming in to disrupt any sense of stability or static.
Disrupt your presentation right here and ask you to conclude.
Okay, there. Many forms of practice, many other forms of discipline. So I'll finish on the note, picking up on some of the messages already said by others about access. One of the things that we're working on now is going, if you remember my previous slide, of having about 5 programs. Architecture is got far more to offer the world than just becoming a registered architect. The value of the knowledge base itself, the value of the education, has got infinitely more riches to offer the world than just becoming a registered architect. And that's what schools should be offering more. I could say more, but I could stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Can I ask the rest of the panelists to join me on the sofas on our new elevated stage this year? It's a step up from last year's series. Right. Well, I'll keep my questions brief so you can interrogate the panel yourselves. But I'd just like to kind of begin with, I suppose, the common thread that in all of your presentations, none of you seemed happy with the status quo. And the thing that recurred was that architectural education is too long and too prescriptive as it stands. Now, you're all directors of architecture schools, so why on earth are we still signing up to the RIBA Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 system? When every year there's a conference of the heads of schools of architecture, every year they say, oh, it's too long, let's reform, let's break away from the RIBA. Why are we still there? Why hasn't the RIBA released its grip over architectural education?
I don't mind starting, kicking it off. What I was trying to point out was that there's a sort of a relationship, which I agree isn't the only one, between the profession and training for the profession and parts 1, 2 and 3. And it's we thought really hard when we were setting up an RMM march here about whether not to register it on the basis that it was an act of saying you don't need it. But in fact, I felt on reflection that was a disservice to students who, and in fact maybe to the possibility of future disruption of the profession, because it would exclude students from having what is currently a registration route. So if you, I guess my response is, if you're standing outside of a registration route, you might stand at the margins and therefore marginalise, whereas if you sit within it, you disrupt it. And ultimately, it's not our decision to provide a registration route, it's the ARB's. So it's going through a review. I think that the general state of affairs may change, but how we sign up to it, I agree, is a question that is to be... By signing up, are we just prolonging this same system that hasn't changed for so long? How can we change it from the inside?
I mean, that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 question, I've been tilting at that for a long time in terms of the length of architectural education. There's all sorts of reasons why it could be, but I have a suspicion, 2 suspicions, one of which is that clearly if you culled 1/5 or 2/5 of an architectural education out of the built environment, higher education economy in one hit, there'd be a big problem, economically and financially and in terms of employment. So I think there's a problem with doing it in that simple way. The other one is really that years are totally irrelevant. The important conversation is to think about credit. Accumulating bits of stuff, bits of experience, anywhere and everywhere, and bolting those together into something which gives you an award that you can sell and be employed with. So I don't think we should talk about years anymore, nor should the RIBA.
Well, I don't think we should talk exclusively about students and practitioners, because one of the innovative things about our school is we say you are an architect when you come to the LSA. We don't care if we say that. We haven't been told off. The RIBA loved it so much that the chair of the RIBA visiting panel has now become one of our tutors. We say you are in practice. If you look back at your education, all of us, you will find embedded in your behaviours and values as a student, particularly in diploma, that you are expressing what goes on to form your practice. So we see the practice of being a student is actually that of a practitioner, proto-practitioner. So we see much more fluidity between the two. And it's been extraordinary. I didn't have time to mention that straight out of our first cohort who finished a year ago, we have one completely autonomous practice already. We have members of virtually everybody in our first cohort and going forward had done their own independent projects before. We've got people who have got enormous commissions in the first year at the moment. So we are a school that attracts people who don't see that accreditation and those timeframes is actually relevant to their own practice.
So, I mean, if the RIBA is so open to your new model, does the problem actually lie with the schools themselves? I mean, has the Bartlett put pressure on RIBA to change, or is it actually the Bartlett itself which is perpetuating the, part one, part two system that hasn't changed since the 1950s?
We're reaching a really interesting point now. More than 50% of our students next year will be on non-accredited programs. And that's telling you everything. You've got to look at what students are saying and what applicants are saying. That's where the message is. It's not in Portland Place. It may not even be in Bloomsbury. It's our first years this year were born in 1999. They will be reaching the peak of their careers in 2035 to 2045, thereabouts, maybe, roughly speaking. What do I know about what the world's going to be like in 2035? What is it? 2016 was bad enough. I thought I had a reasonable ability to forecast 5 or 10 years ahead, roughly speaking, this and that. 2016 just went, it was the idea that you could forecast the world, to that length of time. We have to become far more adaptable. There's no question about it. I don't think we should wait for the RIBA or the ARB. I think those mechanisms exist, perfectly good reason. There's no need to rip them apart, but there's a very good argument to offer alternatives and let those alternatives develop the same weight that the current models presently offer. Current models have 150 years plus holding them up. We need new models that will last 10, 20, 30 years, and they'll dictate the future. It won't be Portland Place. It'll be who wants to choose those courses. I mean, people choosing to go to university have got the most important voice in the world today. It's not people like me, frankly, that matter.
They'll be voting with their feet, ultimately. Could I just come on to, I suppose, the culture of architectural education? I mentioned slightly flippantly at the beginning this very masochistic way that we all behave in architecture school. But then reading the statistics about more than a third of students have had to seek medical help over mental health issues. This is a really serious topic. I was interested in how your various schools have tackled these issues. Have you put time limits on how long students can work? Have you introduced mechanisms where you have to hand in work maybe the day before a crit to avoid this insane, staying up all night? You just each kind of respond to that.
I'm happy to. We've a lot more to do on it. I think that's the message. I think mental health is a deeply serious issue. There are all sorts of legacies associated with mental health. We need to be very careful that we're not implying all mental health issues in architecture schools are caused by architectural education. They're not. But it's possible the environment of architectural education is unsuited or is certainly perhaps creating an experience for those who are vulnerable to those sorts of responses that we have yet to fully understand. I think workload is without a doubt the key point about it all. Hot housing architecture schools is a very, very dangerous thing to do. We're very aware of it in the Bartlett. We're not on top of it yet. is a conversation we have regularly with our students. It's
Are there mechanisms you've put in place? I mean, say, making the studios not 24 hours or anything
they're
like
not,
that?
No, we have a curfew. You have to be out by 10:30, but, you can't follow students home, stop them at working at home. There's all sorts of dialogues that need to take place. In fact, in the next few weeks, we're setting up an event to address this issue specifically, to try and push aside the curriculum, push aside the studio as being the place that refers to, that kind of justifies all practice and all actions, and just get back to brass tacks and saying, what's good for your health and what are you trying to get out of all of this?
No.
I think I agree. It's a sort of burgeoning issue, and I think it's it is across the sector, and it's something that it still needs addressing specifically, which I'll say something about. But I also think that it comes out of a line of education that goes behind it. So school education that is increasingly outcomes orientated, and that idea of education as a sort of experimental space in which the sorts of frameworks of credit and grading are freer has gradually been eroded over the last 20 years. And so I do think that the anxiety of students as they currently sit is not only in how they care for others, look after themselves and live in the world, an increasingly expensive world, but also how perhaps their resilience at school hasn't been presented as well to them as it might have been 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think that's a real problem. In terms of what we do, I think I said I think the idea that you are abused and then you become an abuser is a sort of abhorrent, turn. That the idea that you would still live out those sorts of cycles is obviously wrong. There are in an institutional setting lots of ways in which students can get help, but I don't think that that's the only way. And obviously the curriculum and how we run it is absolutely critical. The idea that students take the lead, that they are able to sort of talk about and frame what in a more vocal way, so not to be fearful of being able to come forward and upend a hierarchy of learning, really, that allows that to happen and those discussions to happen. Because ultimately the level at which anxiety comes in is really hard to judge.
Deborah, how does the LSA deal with this?
Well, we're really small. We know everybody, we know each other, so it's an incredibly intimate organisation that tries to push away institutional behaviours to begin with. From the get-go, we put group working together and everybody gets the same grade in the group. Something the RIBA had a bit of trouble and ARB just didn't know what to do with. This idea that a group of people working together can kind of share the stresses and strains is really important, especially in first year, almost mimicking practice. And in the same way, we use a fantastic life coach who teaches techniques of understanding group behaviours and individual behaviours, just like you do in business practice, of understanding the kind of roles you can have as teams. And then she also offers, we offer a route to personal counselling if you need it. So it's very kind of pastoral approach.
Yeah, I think as I was trying to say, ultimately it's about values and it's a choice. I think we have values that in a relationship between education and practice, there is a whole series of values which should be challenged. I teach in Sweden, and several people in the room do at the moment. And those values are absolutely turned on their head. Asking people to attend after certain hours, to make projects that require them to not be carers, not have a life, not go skiing, are considered to be absolutely oppressive. And they're shamed as a set of values, alternative values. And I think it's a choice. I think we have an impediment, though. I think in terms of the way in which practice operates, the economy of practice does, to a certain extent, rely on a degree of exploitation, which Mel is talking about, in terms of money. So we are inducting students unwittingly into a sort of economic process of exploitation.
Yeah, in a way.
To stop that would cause economic chaos for the architectural profession.
But it could be phased out incrementally.
Well, I don't know if it would create economic chaos if we actually broke down what we do and asked people to pay for it, which is beyond that RIBA. We do so much beyond that, and we should charge for it. So.
I think the question was about mental health kind of generally, and I think one of the things I think we also need to grasp is just how radically different it is to be in your early 20s today as it was for me. There's so many other kind of missiles coming into your life compared to what it was in the 80s. It just feels like, such a long time ago, such a dreamy time. It had its problems, but nothing like what it's like now. And, the missiles are financial, but they're also to do with just being bombarded with so much information. And I think this is something which you really need to understand an awful lot more. It's a very sophisticated and complex problem. But, students are bombarded with imagery and information, which creates anxiety about their own, pace of production or their own, in a sense, level in relation to that information.
The curse of Instagram.
I saturated 10% of the information when I was a student that students do today, and my brain was about to blow then. So I think this is something else we need to address. Whether you're a student in a practice or in a school, whatever, life now is quite different to what it was before, and that needs to be addressed.
I'm keen to open it up because I can see lots of hands putting into eyes. We'll begin over here. Do we have a roving microphone? Yes. It's just in this corner here to begin with. And then there.
I was wondering what you were thinking about, is it possible that maybe the very nature of architecture is the reason why its teaching can cause so much stress? You were touching a little bit about how much, like in the intrinsic nature of architecture, the fact that it touches basically everything, maybe the way it's taught, the sort of very mechanistic view or scientific way, that the fact that you have to know about almost everything might be the reason why it's so much crazy to study it in that manner or another way.
That it's almost too broad as a subject,
Exactly.
the way it's structured at the moment. Should we be specialising and focusing
too broad.
more than we do at the moment in our curricula?
No, I think it's about understanding the ways people can work. So we try to deploy agile working. I don't know if you're familiar with agile working. The architecture school is based on this premise that you do this thing called research, which is basically fuck around for about 3 months, having a really interesting time thinking of research as separate from design. When you practice, you have to design straight away. If you design software, you don't sit around thinking about your program for 3 months. You start designing your program and testing and seeing if it fails. So that's agile thinking, is where you design, test, design, test, design, test. So you design from the get-go. We demand, and we've been introducing agile thinking, and it's really cheesy, well-used term, but it makes such a difference when you say, come to your first meeting with a design speculation. It's very difficult for students coming from undergraduate, where there has been this culture of the pause and then the panic to produce Instagram beauty instantly at the end. We like mess, we like process, and we like using your time wisely. And that comes from Toyota agile thinking.
I was just going to say that. I have to take exception.
Good.
I think that idea that you build a course of study through what's effectively work-based mechanisms that have been trialled and tested through sort of employment systems, I think is really dangerous. And that I think the idea that higher education or education is absolutely the core of our sort of value system as a society, and it's there that we can experiment and make some space. I totally understand the research proposed dilemma, but I think it's disingenuous to try to say that actually a critical space of understanding the world is not an incredibly valuable thing, and that higher education effectively allows that to happen. In fact, if you're not careful, the model that you're talking about leads you ever more into sort of effectively just co-opting and being complicit with the work systems that you're part of.
But
that was my... That's
so you saw the work there, 14 weeks, 5 people, extraordinary speculative production, amazing space to think. I think it's just a different way of practice.
Just bringing it back to the question, I mean, is there a danger that actually, by doing so much contextual and social and political research around our projects, you're kind of paralysed, and it's very difficult to be propositional if you spent a whole term doing the research. So actually, I think it's a very good question that the subject can be so dauntingly broad when you're trying to research all of these things around your idea. Is there not something to be said to just getting on with it?
But that's what students do, isn't it? They get on with it. I think students, the students that I see, not only in the Bartlett but all over the country, around the world, most of them are interested in production. They're interested in getting their ideas out into the world, whether it's in the studio, in that institution, or other audiences, and then informing it and enriching it through a process of research. It's not research first and then project later, or research first and then life later. Students start designing in first year, they should anyway, and they should understand that is what it is to understand what architecture is. Now, whether you become an architect or not, it's kind of neither here nor there to some extent. It's understanding what architectural processes and practices are and what the subject is, and discovering a place within it. If you think of higher education as only being about research which is abstracted from practice, then you're misreading it.
Robert?
Well, architecture's decision to become part of higher education obviously is relatively recent. And one does have to question whether the highly marketized version of higher education that we have at the moment is an environment which ultimately can nurture the sort of space for freedom and experimentation that we're all talking about. And I do think that some of the moves to take architectural education away from that environment is not just about expanding the field and all of that. It's about certain problems with the infrastructure of higher education and how it no longer allows for that sort of space or dignity to make projects in that way.
The next question was just there. And then...
Thank you. I'm a recent graduate of CSM Architecture BA. And I just thought everyone laid out a really good shop window, but I wondered if they could just take a moment to celebrate our hypocrisy, which was a phrase I learnt here. And by that I mean Mel talks about operating within the system. Well, this is the first system that you learn to operate in the cracks in. By this I mean CSM. So there's a contradiction or kind of a schism there in that you want to challenge the system, but the best learning I got from challenging any system was the CSM system. And then other things like the artificial pressure that's created, perhaps through the hubris of education, as you're saying, and that leading to depression. It's a display of production with the degree shows. There's an inherent hypocrisy there to what you're talking about now. And I think it all came out, my theory on it was that it maybe came down to a lack of self-satire. No one looks at it in a kind of, celebrating your hypocrisy. There's no satire to it. And finally, there's a whole bury it under the carpet whilst we solve it culture, which is in itself contradictory. And I wanted just everyone to talk about, great, you've made great cases for future educational systems that I hope you're all practicing now, but where's your inherent hypocrisy?
Where is your self-satire?
I think it's all about the money, isn't it? That's the problem. The problem is it's about, it's costing a lot. And that's changed the relationship. Happened overnight. When fees came in and then they went up again, it changed the relationship fundamentally. And it's a reality, lots of people would like to see not there, but it's a reality. It's a reality that's set by the environment we're in. I'd like to see the government pay for higher education. Currently, I get 5% of my budget comes from the state. I don't know what it's like for other members of the panel here, but that's preposterous. The government's investing 5% in the development of a fundamental practice, fundamental to being a citizen in a city, fundamental to producing, aiding the production of that environment. All the things that we do beyond and within the design and delivery of buildings. That's what the government thinks it's worth, 5%. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's not good enough. Yeah. And that's really the seed of this problem. This is a discipline, a subject, an area of knowledge, an area of research, fundamental to being human on the planet, and that's not seemingly enough of a concern for governments of the day. And I think that if we want to talk about fundamentals, let's turn that upside down.
Is it because architecture schools aren't demonstrating their worth, perhaps, in the most compelling way they could to sources of funding?
I think
I'd like to pick up on the final show as an example of something that you mentioned, it's hypocrisy, because it gets me every time. You visit these shows, you realise that the entire length of the architecture course is geared towards the 1 metre space you get at the end of your diploma or whatever it is. So you make your beautiful model and your drawing, and it's an exercise in graphic design and representation, because the final show is your shop window to get a job. Is that actually one of the biggest problems, the way education is structured now, that we're all aiming towards an exhibition rather than actually thinking about how to make space and fix the city and the things that architecture is actually about?
Yeah.
Yeah, on that one.
But you all have shows, right?
So I was just going to say, because Rob, you brought up the hypocrisy of the higher education, but can you make it more about maybe the Bartletts? You did mention it, the shop window thing, as you said, Ollie, but I mean, that's something you can actively change. The bullshit going along with marketisation of education is something we all face. But what about your own, something that you can actually represent?
Oh, well, back to money, you have to make the experience and the value of that education worthwhile. So one of the other conversations that needs to take place in this spectrum is what happens after you graduate. So, architectural education needs to stop fighting for a very narrow bandwidth of the world, and it has to populate a much broader bandwidth. We've got contributions we can make to the world far beyond a narrow idea of what it is to be a professional. The professional is a concept, don't forget, invented in the 1830s. We can reinvent it. There's an enormous skills shortage. There's enormous loads of rubbish being built in the world, badly designed cities, badly designed buildings. But also the procurement process is faulty. The value systems that allow those projects to come into place are faulty. And yet it seems that we're fighting, all of us, to occupy a very narrow bandwidth. So what we are doing, to answer your question, is opening up other alternative routes where architectural research and education can direct that talent. So, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, more than 50% of our students now are choosing these alternative routes, and they're taking that knowledge into other places. And I think that'll carry on as long as it's seen to have value, and that's where the difference will be made. So it's pre-entry issues, there's the duration issue, and there's what happens after. All of it needs to change and progress.
Okay. Well, I think that I'm a great fan of self-parody and hypocrisy. That's great. I just think that it's dangerous. I think we have a tendency as a community to rattle around in our own sort of world, and I think to further parody ourselves at a moment where there's such pressing challenges for us to address, it's not the right time. I think the bigger challenge now is to stop that fragmentation and that playfulness and that sense of our own culture, and temper all of that against the really hard challenges, which I think are becoming really shrill. And we are culpable in ignoring them.
I agree. I'm not sure what you're asking, Jake, but if you're asking us to critique our own institutions, then maybe what we're saying is that in our own individual ways, we very much believe that we're responding to something. It's not something to... we might sit along a double sort of edged sword of complicity with systems that we're in, but we're not doing it with a sort of, irony or cynicism. It's done with an attempt to deal very much with you as a cohort and a group of people who need to be supported in difficult times. So I don't know why. I agree. I don't think it's something I'm particularly comfortable with.
I think you should rid yourself of this binary condition. I think we have to rid ourselves of a binary sense of good and evil and look at architecture as absolutely, totally entangled within so many systems that nobody comes out clean. Look at us sitting in this extraordinary space, with extraordinary wealth surrounding us. Where do you draw the line? Architecture cannot extract itself from a culture and keep a clean conscience. You can come to every interface in your engagement with architecture and ask yourself what you think your values are and how you're going to deploy them. I think it's impossible to sort of say there are good guys and bad guys. It's more complicated.
Next question, please, over there.
I came to London in the 80s from Germany to study architecture because it was much more exciting and it was very experimental and it wasn't that expensive to come here. Now I set up a practice in London and also teach degree at the CAS. And a lot of our students are very busy working and don't have enough time to study. And I advise them to maybe go to Europe and study because it's free. Is that good advice?
Very quick.
I'm afraid I tell people the same.
Yeah.
Are all our best students going to go to Europe? Have they already gone?
I think that's a very good point because that is that's something that's happening and we're all aware of it. But also we may have that even more a problem in terms of Brexit and how that affects our division and separation. Like, what is our culture about in terms of learning when we don't even have a sort of European inflow, even of those people who are prepared to pay? I think I would just answer that really simply that, I certainly don't try to, although we might have, let's say, a tongue-in-cheek marketing approach to the way we set up our stall today, the truth is that for students where income is an issue, it's an absolute piece of advice that I'd give.
I'm still clinging to the delusion that we're still in Europe, but
it could still be cancelled yet. I mean, are you noticing the effect on your respective institutions?
Yes.
That good students are leaving.
I've been doing that
Not
for years.
applying.
I mean, there's been traffic to and from Europe for decades. As it happens, our European application numbers have gone up this year, which may be a rush before Brexit, I suppose. I don't know. But it could, I would imagine it'll drop off if this stupid thing goes through. But, that's what's happening right now. I mean, it's insane to think that wouldn't be a good suggestion. The suggestion of where to study should fit around the individual and what it is they want to study and what would be good for them. If they have the choices, of course. But if not everyone has those kind of choices, we need to be able to offer places to those who can't go to Europe or anywhere else for that matter. So, the European model is interesting in terms of its difference to the UK model. That's a conversation that could come out of this process that this country is going through right now, in terms of defining its position in relation to higher education, as opposed to using defaults to regulation.
Is Moscow an attractive prospect at this time of year?
I mean, the Global Practice Programme is set up as a sort of very sophisticated laundering system within the economics of European higher education. And I won't go any further at the moment. But I think the other thing about your question, which is really interesting, when everybody talks about students working, and it's not about working in architecture, it's serving pizzas, it's doing all sorts of things. For most of their time, something we really concentrated on in the free unit was to say, hang on, look at that hard. The thing that you're actually doing, the thing that's actually engaging you, whether it's caring, education, whether it's working in different ways, maybe you can make that the basis of the way in which you make architecture. So this schism between the sort of student as an engaged, caring citizen doing stuff and this codified world of architecture education, that separation is untenable, particularly if students are spending the vast majority of their time in that other space. Make that other space the basis of how they qualify, by crediting it, but also by making it the basis of projects.
And that's why I'm very surprised. I mean, talking about new models, but I'm incredibly surprised that part-time architectural education has never taken off, because it just seems bizarre that it is. I mean, perhaps now it's beginning. I think that there are very few part-time courses, and they often fold. And the London School of Architecture models is a sort of mode somewhere in between. But that idea that working alongside studying isn't something that would be enriching and that could be celebrated rather than seen as a sort of problem. I mean, in other areas of the world, that's totally normal, where countries have never had decent higher education funding. It's completely normal that you live at home and work alongside study, and that's what my sons do in Melbourne. So, that's an impoverished model, but in another way, it's a way in which you sort of think on your feet and do something else. So,
but I was really surprised when we set up the LSA. I thought we would only get UK students, and we get them from all over the world, those that are allowed to come, because we are not, what's it called, HF, and I don't know, HFQ, whatever it is. We are not yet a fully fledged higher educational institute, and now because we are still sort of, we get our accreditation through the good offices of your old establishment, London Met. We are not allowed to have a global number. We're only allowed to have people who come in under the European rule or through the Commonwealth. But we have people from New Zealand, South Africa, all of Europe coming in, and it's really surprising. They have foregone a free education because for them that blurring messiness is the mode of life they want. And I think we are kind of beyond this sort of notion of education as this kind of sort of zone, rather like modernism put functions in the city into zones. We like the messy middle, and we think it's really great.
Can I just counteract it? This idea of kind of nomadic school, and you just find space to work, and you're all agile. It sounds very nice, but I would argue that the beauty of architecture education, and what I experienced, was studio culture. And all the schools that put me off were the ones that didn't have studio space. And what I'm seeing increasingly is the fact that a lot of schools don't offer studios anymore. I mean, CSM has kind of one room, is that right, to share between all of the different years?
Yeah, maybe some students should put their hands up and say what they think.
Is that something that we should be concerned about, that in this kind of atomization and nomadic agile working, we're losing?
Well, we do have it in second year, just to correct you. We're only in the first year of nomadic in that.
I think you're a sort of romantic. I think for the reality is, except in the most privileged educational environments that have studio systems, the vast majority of students are not in a position to benefit from that late 20th century model. That's a romantic sense of being in a space. They are in the background trying to just hang on to that outdated model of practice, of educational practice. It's exclusive, it's discriminatory. It discriminates against people who care, have caring responsibilities. It discriminates against all sorts of people. So it's an increasingly narrow conceit, this sense of that little room with people working.
So are we losing teamwork and collaboration as a result? Or people just do it in McDonald's instead? Where does this happen, this
Teamwork is taking place elsewhere. It's taking place in other contexts in a much more visceral and exciting way than it takes place in architectural education.
I'm going to have to disagree with you, Robert. I think the privilege has been in a position to make the case for space, and I certainly feel we've been very privileged in the last few years, been able to get more space for the architecture school, and that required a very, very robust debate on defending architectural education. It was beyond the money. It was a case for what that form of practice requires. And it was entirely about the defence of the world you've just described, Robert, of creating spaces where teamwork, where interaction, where practice can occur in a network of different nodes that have different views on what that should be. So when I came to London first, one of the jobs I got was in a group practice. And it's often occurred to me that it's a bit like what an architecture school is like. I was a hired draftsman that moved around from different practice to different practice. And within the floor plate, and there was a Dryden Street in Covent Garden, a famous group practice. That wasn't the one I was in, but this idea that you can see different agendas, different approaches to the discipline being performed and developed and critiqued in close proximity, and having spaces for debate for those ideas to occur is vital. So I think a school in its best possible sense, ought to bring all the dimensions you're describing into its own environment. If it doesn't, then it becomes static. If you don't have that space for practice to occur within a school, then it just becomes a place of module kind of interaction. You know, it doesn't become a network or an ecology. So I think, you know, I think one thing we need to do as a community is to defend the need for space for architectural education. I think that argument has become weakened, sadly, you know, in recent decades.
When do you know you failed?
You know you failed when the content in those spaces ceases to become relevant to those who are engaged in the process. Students' voices today are far more powerful than they say were in my day. We were in great danger of sort of reflecting on today on a model that was in place 20 years ago. You know, the power of the student body in a school is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. I'm going to take two more. Yeah, there's one back there.
I think we can realise that when we start to actually figure out ways of tackling the value of land, and actually that's the way to make space. But I wanted to ask, should our teachers be taught to teach? A lot of architectural educators don't have any formal teacher training. Should that be a requirement?
Very good question. Should we introduce teacher training for architectural tutors? Do any of you have it already as part of your...
Well, in fact, it is actually part of the, that is part of the things that bureaucracies of institutions do, and it's now mandatory that you do a postgraduate certificate in learning and teaching when you become an academic. So that's been the case for about 10 years. So most people do, or they have a significant body of work and they're part of an institution called the Higher Education Academy and you're a senior fellow or something. So
even for visiting day tutors who teach studio?
Day tutors is a slightly different issue because they can go for those postgraduate certificates, but they may not do it because of their busy lives in trying to juggle different things. So I would say if Jeremy was here, he would be nodding his head and shouting it, of course, because I think that is a really good question. And yeah, we shouldn't all assume, as we seem to in architectural education globally, that we're just good at something because we're doing it on the side. Having said that, I do feel a little bit like, having looked at postgraduate certificates of learning and teaching, I'm not awfully sure that what you're getting in a teaching environment in architecture isn't quite a well-honed system. As long as it's looked after and people are in a sort of moderating capacity, it's really performing quite highly. My experience of those certificates is that they're tick-boxy and drab. That's not to answer the question that you shouldn't have a really good, ambitious form of it, though.
I think I think you're right in the short term because there's a lot of sort of amateurism. But I think architectural education suffers from being bounded by two forms of professionalism. I think the whole nature of professionalism, whether it's within the architectural profession or professionalism and within the educational profession, tends to codify things, make things static, make bodies of knowledge intransigent, expels invaders. And I think if there is that sense of professionalism, it has to be a professionalism which is much, much more subtle than that offered either by the practice or by the current orthodoxy of higher education.
For me, it's a question that requires a long answer, but one way that I would answer it, I think it's absolutely vital that you have teachers that either practice or research, or preferably both. If we think that education can be delivered just by professional teachers who are not active researchers or active practitioners, well then it's all over. You know, that becomes just some form of presenting modules. That in itself will not enrich the subject or the discipline. So, yes, there are all sorts of processes one needs to look at in evolving the role of the teacher, but a school must be populated by active researchers and active practitioners.
Does the LSA have a policy on this?
How many teaching qualifications do you have, Deborah?
I have no teaching qualifications whatsoever. We just have an incredibly reflective and harsh feedback regime. which means that you can report and let people know immediately. We have surgeries each term. We have, you can feed back immediately if things aren't, because we're so small. But I was going to say something else. We have because we don't have a unit system, we have a policy of constantly changing our tutors, so things don't become
do you have a fixed term in terms of
I think
number
we do,
of years?
yeah. I don't know the exact contract requirements, but we make sure we replenish. I can see one of my fellow design think tank practitioners over there at the back, Studio Eggeray West. I don't know, have you got any formal teaching qualifications? No, hasn't done it before. We're trying it, trying Christoph and David out, and it's fantastic. It's very fluid. So.
Final question, and then more questions in the bar afterwards.
You've said some really, really great things, the panel, but it's also been I've found it slightly disheartening, I suppose. But I guess it's also because, the general picture on education, higher education seems disheartening in that, the marketisation of education, the fact that students are treated as customers, I find very, very depressing, and I think it's something, with the new Office for Students that's just been created, it's a shame that everybody got so wound up about Toby Young whilst completely missing the point that the Office for Students is going even further in the marketisation of education, turning students into customers. And I think that, also the kind of intellectual space of higher education, not just architectural education, but generally the kind of closing down of free speech on campus, the fact that education is now seen as a time where young people need to be protected and in a kind of safe space from ideas, is the complete reverse of what it should be, which is a complete opening up to ideas and a time for experimentation. And I mean, many of you on the panel have spoken about the importance of the institution as this kind of free space for intellectual ideas, for experimentation, for radicalism. But actually, none of you have really talked about, what those ideas are. And I'd maybe if we're running out of time, I'd like to hear, maybe one recent radical experimental idea that has come out of your institution, because I really feel like we've talked a lot about the process, the market, the policies and all of these constraints. But, you're also in a very privileged position of being in academia where you do have the time to think about ideas and to challenge things. So why aren't we talking more about the actual ideas and what's what's coming out of education? What's it adding to the world of architecture?
Do you want an idea from the institutions or that have come out of student work? Sorry. From the institutions. Yeah, okay. Go. One radical, innovative idea that's come out of the way you're...
With a little bit of passion as well.
Yeah.
Architecture is about passion. You don't just stay hours on end producing models, drawing just what? I haven't heard any of that. There's been no talk about architecture, but the frame of architecture, and not about its content. I have to agree with this lady that we would like to know about these radical ideas and why on earth should anybody become an architect right now? Can we?
I thought I touched on that we are at a moment when I hoped I touched on in my hurry to get through my presentation. At the LSA, we are completely passionate about how spatial thinking beyond the boundaries of a definition of architecture can solve problems. And it's really strange when you actually put this into you apply this. My involvement in the LSA has fundamentally changed the way my practice works. We completely refuse to go with the big corporate models. In terms of our business model, we don't want to be big.
But your clients?
Our clients are big and small. We have a complete range.
You don't refuse corporate clients?
Of course not, because they are the custodians financially of the city, but we work with them and say overtly, our client is the city, And you are also one of our clients, but the client is the city. And that confidence to talk like that has come through the LSA, where I think as a practitioner now, I go in and say, I'm an architect and a spatial strategist. I offer these additional services. I charge for them. I get the license to claim a bigger territory because of what the LSA says. You're not in a box. You're not defined just by a profession. The way the city operates is much more flexible than people appreciate. There's been this amazing revolution going on over the last 10 years. The LSA wouldn't exist 10 years ago without the digital revolution. We're part of that. I think you've got to, I mean, it's a shame, I think, that we didn't have student voices to put the flesh on the bones of us sort of dry academics talking, because that's the proof. I mean, go and talk to the students. They're really passionate.
Do we have any LSA students in the audience?
Hello, passionate person. Is it true or have I lied?
But Vicky, you then proceeded to do exactly what you were criticising. You gave a litany of the horrors of this institution. I do not accept that we are in an institutional condition. If you want passion, come with me to those other environments. Come to Calais, come to some of these environments where actually new relationships are being brokered between things, systems, built environments, individuals, the world's problems. Not an architect present. You lot were not there at the point at which all of that happened. But if you go there, you will find a totally extraordinary passion, a passion that is missing from this world that we're talking about, which is over-institutionalized, over-codified, and very near the end of its worth and value. Passion is not here. Passion is somewhere else, but it's there in buckets.
Now, what innovation has come out of CSM?
Here. I don't think this.
Not here.
I agree. I don't think it's about. I mean, we're talking about it, and maybe it needs to be lived. So we're talking about experiences, and one of the things, though, if you ask me to answer that question, I'd say that being within an art school environment where, you know, on any one day, you can see some amazing work sitting in front of you and understand how the relationship of that is, what the relationship of that is to architecture. And that's a really exciting, vibrant place to be. I don't think I didn't say that. But again, I don't think it's all about architecture. I mean, I'm actually sick of the word. For me, it's about it's a completely complex, intermeshed issue of what on earth is going on in our world and how we can relate and talk about those things in a way where we use this as a vehicle. So personally, yeah, architecture's great, but it's about more than that. If it isn't, it's really sad.
And finally, Bob, what radical idea has come out of the Bartlett recently?
I think the most important thing, and if you want passion, come to our open crits on March the 20th and 21st. On all four of the open landings of the building, you'll have crits, and the whole place is like an intensely active bus station. That's, you know, if you don't hear it from me, you know, I've got this quite boring job to do, it's just managing things, but the voice that you need to hear is the voice of the students, so please come along. The most important thing, Vicky, I think that's probably happened in the last decade or so, and this thought was prompted by referring to students as customers, is in reality, it felt, frankly, we were treated more like customers 20 years ago, leaving aside the transaction issue here. What's happened in the last 10 years or so is the relationship between student and staff research and staff practice is far more transparent. And I think that's extremely healthy and extremely positive. There was a time previously that students' operations were seen to happen separate to research in the institution. And the only way in which that was exposed perhaps was through a lecture or through a publication. But what you're seeing now in studios, in schools, is how the student practice, in a sense, is putting pressure on staff research. So I don't recognize this myth of a unit system being, you know, a series of didactic processes. Far from it. What's happened in the last 10 years, that idea has been turned around on its head. It's students predominantly that are driving the agendas of units. Staff are trying to keep ahead of them most of the time. And then that exchange is a far more vibrant and exciting process than I remember, frankly, from 10, 20 years ago. And those students go on to, form their own practices shortly afterwards, in whatever form it might be. It may not be in conventional architectural practice. And they often come back and they participate in dialogue and discussion. So that ecology, I think, is the radical change that's happened in architectural education. Sorry if it sounds boring, but that is, frankly, quite distinctly different than models that were in place before, which were didn't have any of that kind of energy to it. Yeah.
So, just before I ask you to thank our speakers, I just want to say there's tickets still available for the next debate on work on the 8th of February, which will feature the Architectural Workers Campaign Group facing off against Patrick Schumacher from Zaha Hadid Architects, Harriet Harris, who's setting up an architects union, which you should all join, Peter Morris from AHMM, who's just transformed the practice into an employee-owned company, and Lucy Carmichael, who's Director of Practice from the RIBA. So we can finally put it to Reba. So I hope to see you all there. And please thank our speakers for coming along.